also required to cover their charms? It's not fair to just kill a man who steps out of line and the woman is free to expose herself. She might say, well, listen, when I wear my miniskirt, right, my halter top or whatever, I am not inviting men. This is not my intention. My intention is just to look nice. This is the style, and this is what is considered to be nice, and that's how I want to look. But this is not the point. The consequence is that men are attracted in this way. Common sense tells us that we should avoid this kind of clothing to minimize the abuse, the harassment which is taking place in the society. This is common sense. For example, in Canada, some years back, maybe about 5 years ago, women argued for the right in summer to walk the street topless. Since in summer men commonly will wear shorts and go walking down the main streets topless, right? They call it bare-chested. They said women should have the right to do that, because if a woman did it, she would be arrested for lewd conduct. They say, why? Why should we be arrested for lewd conduct when the men are able to do this? You know, men and women are equal. No, that's what we said in the Constitution, they're equal, so we should have the right. They argued and won. In Ontario, Toronto and the rest of Ontario, it is permissible for a woman in summer, because this is when they would do it, to walk down the main streets topless. However, since that law was passed 5 years ago, there is no record of a single woman doing it. Why? Common sense tells them that if they did it in public, going down the main streets, they would suffer. They would suffer. So they choose not to do it. That's common sense telling them. So similarly, when we talk about dress, we should keep this in mind, that women should be required to cover themselves, and at the same time we should have strong laws dealing with those who are involved in rape, who would harm women in this way. And there's an article I have here, which is from the USA Today, called Men, Women and Sex, We Need Your Help. Darren Snyder, a reporter for USA Today, non-Muslim, he's writing, he says, do your skirts have to be so short? Do your jeans have to be so tight? Can't your clothing be less provocative? He's a non-Muslim writer. And he goes into discussing the need on the part of women who complain about harassment of men, that they should also dress themselves in a more modest way. And he actually states in here, he says, talking about the men first, and he puts the blame, he says, yes, men, it's men's fault. He says that that's the men's fault. But he says it's a difficult dilemma for women. Many men have one-track minds. Even if women wore bed sheets and drapes, some men would still be able to indulge in whatever visions tickle their fantasies. But if you dressed, say, in long flowing, loose-fitting garments, like some traditional Muslim women, you don't have to cover your face. In my book, he said, this is him, it would be easier on men trying to overcome the entrenched notion of man as a sexual hunter-gatherer. He said, men need your help. Our spirit is willing, but our flesh is weak. So, this is a non-Muslim writing on this matter. This is reality. So when we look at the rates of rape, for example, in North American society, where if we just look at 3 years, 1994, 1995, 1996. In 1994, you had 251,560 rapes and sexual assaults. In 1995, you had 354,670. In 1996, you had 432,000, sorry, what figures am I using here? First one was 251,560 in 94, 354,670 in 95, and 432,330 in 96. We're jumping almost by 100,000 every year. This is a trend which you can extrapolate backwards to the turn of the century, so that the graph appears to be going down. It's rising as we go forward into the 2000 and 2001, 2002. If we look at that graph, and we look at the graph for women's clothing from the turn of the century, where women used to go bathing in full dresses. In America, women went bathing in full dresses, and men even covered themselves completely. Till today, where people go bathing virtually naked, wearing bits and pieces of clothing. They call it bikinis and a variety of other things, but in fact they're virtually naked. You see a graph going in the opposite direction, going from fully dressed to fully undressed. Rapes going from few to many. There is a correlation. Yes, there are figures which have to do with rape, and yes, that it tends to happen amongst those people who are in the families, etc. It's not that the strangers are fewer, but even amongst the strangers, I'm just saying that the rate of strangers committing rape is on the rise. And if we put rape aside and just go, and the figures they have in America, they said every minute 5 women are raped in America. Every minute 5 women are raped in America. Leaving those figures aside, just go to the harassment. The reality is that harassment is on the increase. So harm is directed at women in a very obvious way. Islam prescribes the hijab, the garment to protect the woman, and also to identify her in the society. It is not a means of oppression, though some people might oppress with it. I'm not saying that that does not occur somewhere in the world, that there are some people oppressing with a hijab, as people may oppress with virtually anything. But as a basic principle in the religion of Islam, it is not a principle of oppression, but one of protection and identification. It is one in practice of liberation for the woman, as we said, from the oppression of the fashion industry. And if we look at the goals of dress in general in Muslim society, we find that the first goal is the covering of the private parts. Second is the protection from the elements. And third is beautification and attraction. Primary is covering the private parts. Secondary, protection from the elements. And thirdly, beauty. That global culture which is coming on MTV and all the other sources, we can see that the primary purpose of clothing is beautification and attraction. Beautification and attraction. And after that, it is protection from the elements. And last, it is covering the privates. It's the total opposite. This is why you will find in the dead of winter in Chicago, where the cold wind known as the hawk, rips through you, at 20, 30 degrees below zero, you shiver just thinking about it. You will find women walking out in miniskirts in the dead of winter. How? What is the intent here? Obviously, it is attraction of the opposite sex. Well, the woman might say, as I said, it's just style. But the bottom line, the fashion industry is geared towards attraction. That is the goal. So Islam seeks to bring all of these principles under control. It's a part of a system. And this system actually does not exclude men. The system actually does not exclude men. There is hijab for men too. No, they're not required to wear the scarf, the khimar, but they are required to cover their bodies, primarily between the navel and the knee. That is the minimum. Should be covered in a loose garment, which does not form and shape the private parts and expose it. That is the requirement. Unfortunately, many men today in the Muslim world, while being very vigilant to ensure that their women are properly covered, will leave their homes improperly covered. They will wear garments which in fact expose their private parts. Garments which they wouldn't accept for their wives, their daughters, etc. But they are wearing it themselves. And this is something that men also need to keep in mind. So, in summing up the topic, hijab. Hijab, as it faces the secular system which is now being globalized. Secularism which seeks to remove religion from all elements of government and public policy. Which says basically religion is all the same. You can follow whichever one you wish, but don't use it as a symbol. Don't symbolize it in public, schools, etc. This global culture which is coming finds in front of it the Islamic culture. There's a clash, head-on clash. Islamic culture which requires that a woman cover herself. This is a part of the religion. Yes, some Muslims may be lax, not practice it properly in different parts of the world, but as a whole, the Muslim nation recognizes that this principle of modesty is a part and parcel of the religion. So it will stand in opposition to the culture which calls to nudity, calls to liberalizing and liberation, exposure, which is transformed or manifest in the exposure of the bodies of males and females, and in particular in the case of females. So there is a clash happening. That clash does not have to be if that global culture accepts cultural differences. It accepts the right of people to practice their religion as it has been prescribed. Then there is no need for the clash. They accept the principle of hijab within the context of Islam, within the context of a system which promotes modesty, encourages, prescribes modesty. That this is the right of that system and those involved in the system to practice this. So if those who are currently raising such a clamor against the hijab were to wake up to the realities and accept it and embrace it as a part of the cultural diversity of human beings, then there is no problem. In fact, those countries that see schoolgirls wearing a scarf, Muslim schoolgirls wearing a scarf, as a challenge to the system. They want them to conform. They want them to be absorbed by the culture, the home culture. That is their goal. In fact, banning the headscarf will not achieve that goal. It will actually defeat it, because many Muslim families will choose instead to take their children out of schools, these state schools, and put them into Muslim schools, where their values will be reinforced, and where, as the society sees it, fundamentalism will thrive. So actually, they are shooting themselves in their feet. The goal that they intend will not be achieved by the methods that they are applying. So hijab, though it is a symbol of an awakening to Islam, it is among the practices of Muslims. It is not a religious symbol in and of itself. It has symbolic value, but it is not a religious symbol in and of itself. It is an act of worship. It is a religious obligation. And as such, Muslims as well as non-Muslims need to understand it in this context. And having understood it, then the problems which we are facing today in the Muslim world as well as the non-Muslim world, though most of the problems seem to be in the non-Muslim world, these can be resolved quite easily, because Islam is not confrontational. It is not a violent religion. It doesn't seek to impose its way on people. It is a religion which thrives in peace, in times of peace. It spreads most rapidly when there aren't tensions, when there aren't conflicts. When we consider the spread of Islam to Indonesia, 200 million Muslims, not a single Muslim soldier set foot in the largest Muslim country, became a Muslim country from trade, merely from the trade of Muslim traders leaving western, southeastern Arabia, Oman, Yemen, traveling there and trading. So, in summary, Islam is a complete way of life. The hijab is a part and parcel of that way of life. It is not imposed and it is not oppression. It is a means of worship for females. They worship God by wearing it. And it is also practically in the society a means of identifying themselves and a means of protecting themselves from harm. It also protects the society from the harm which comes from exposure. So it protects themselves and it protects the society as a whole. The hijab is not only a physical garment worn, but it is also a state of mind, a state of emotion, where a person, a female, wears that garb to worship God and maintains all of the requirements of that garb in all of their dealings in the society, whether outside their homes or within their homes. Whether among males or even among females, there are requirements in dress. Though it may be relaxed amongst females, it is not relaxed to zero. There are still requirements of Muslim females, even in the presence of other Muslim females. Similarly, hijab is not restricted to females. It is also a part and parcel of male dress. There are requirements, hijab requirements of modesty, of covering, of maintaining an even keel in the society with regards to sexuality, sensuality, that it is kept under control. Though today, from a Western perspective, when one thinks of the veil and this hijab, the image which comes up in many people's minds is that of the 1001 Nights, the harem, the women, belly dancers. This is some of the images which people conjure up. Of course, these are stories, entertainment, novels, fiction. Yes, there may be elements of truth in them, but the whole truth is that the veil, the hijab, is an element or an instrument of worship in Islam, and not one of heightened sensuality. It in fact lowers it in the society, and this is the purpose for which Islam prescribed it. With that, I conclude my presentation, and we will give you an opportunity now for questions. Females may give their questions. There is amongst you one of the sisters who can take those questions down to her father, Brother Niaz, who can collect them and bring them forward. Questions from males, we can take them in the written form, as well as if you'd like to just raise your hand, we can also take questions directly from the floor. Go ahead. Wa alaikum salam. Okay, brother's question concerning niqab or the face veil. Is this a must and a requirement for Muslim women? Well, this is an issue over which Muslim scholars have differed. Some hold that it is not an obligation, but those who hold it's not an obligation hold that it is a strong recommendation. And others hold that it is an obligation. You do have an element amongst modernists who would even go so far as to claim that it isn't an obligation at all. Even the khimar, or the scarf itself, but this is something cultural, and that modesty is only a principle and an idea that can vary from society to society, and as long as you maintain what may be classified as modesty, you're okay. So if you're in the West, what constitutes modesty, which might constitute nakedness in the Muslim world, is okay, But this is, of course, an extreme view which steps outside of the bounds of Islamic law. An Egyptian scholar stated that France is permitted to pass a law banning hijab. Muslims should move to Muslim countries. What is your view, especially for Muslims whose home is in the West? Well, whether France is permitted to or not, that is up to them. Of course, it's their country. They can do what they want to do in the country. But it is something which may be fought legally, because there are also people from various areas of human rights who have actually opposed this. There is an article which is available on the internet, written by one of the big human rights organizations, in which they recommend that they call on France actually to take this back. Human Rights Watch. They said the proposed law is an unwarranted infringement on the right to religious practice, said Kenneth Roth, Executive Director of Human Rights Watch. For many Muslims, wearing a headscarf is not only about religious expression, it is about religious obligation. He has understood the crux of the matter. He said some supporters of the proposed law, known as the draft law concerning the application of the principle of secularism in schools, junior high schools, and high schools, which would come into force in September, believe it is necessary to uphold the separation of church and state in education and to protect the secular state from the perceived threat of religious fundamentalism, particularly Islamic fundamentalism. However, protecting the rights of all students to religious freedom does not undermine secularism in schools. On the contrary, it demonstrates respect for religious diversity, a position fully consistent with maintaining the strict separation of public institutions from any particular religious message. Human Rights Watch recognizes the legitimacy of public institutions seeking not to promote any religion via their conduct or statements. But the French government has taken this step further by suggesting that the state is undermining secularism if it allows students to wear religious symbols. So this is Human Rights Watch, a non-Muslim organization opposed to the ban which is being proposed in France. Now, Muslims should move to Muslim countries. Well, I mean, this of course is something which may not be practical at all. Of course, Muslims, wherever they find that practicing Islam becomes difficult, they are obliged to migrate, to make hijrah. This is an obligation which remains on Muslims until the last day. So the obligation to migrate is a general obligation which Muslims are faced with wherever they are. Even in Muslim countries where they have difficulty practicing Islam, they're obliged to migrate to another area where they can better practice Islam. As for the majority of Muslims, for example, in Western countries who cannot migrate, their responsibility is to try to implement Islam as best they can and to convey the message of Islam to the non-Muslim society in which they live. In case a woman is alone in her home, what clothing should she wear? Well, if she's absolutely alone, of course, she's free, she has to take a bath, whatever. I mean, people take baths, they don't usually wear clothing when they take baths, so it means that sometimes she may take off all of her clothing. So it depends on the circumstance, She doesn't have any particular minimum which is prescribed, but for herself, whatever she feels, most comfortable in, within the bounds of her own personal modesty, then she is permitted to wear as she wishes, within the bounds of her own home when she's alone. What is the exact way of wearing the veil? Oh, this is the same question we looked at earlier. What is the sin for not wearing hijab? Well, of course, this is disobedience to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah Almighty. Women who expose themselves, depending on the severity of the case, could end up it being a source of punishment for them on the Day of Judgment, in the hellfire to some degree, for some period of time or whatever. It just depends on the severity of their acts. But in general, a Muslim is required to try to obey Allah's commands as much as they can. The nature of women and men are different. Isn't it also the nature or the way a man is created according to the Quran as one of the reasons why men look at women in desirous ways? Yes, it is from the nature of men that they are more easily aroused by females, just looking at them, etc. It is part of the difference. And this is why Allah, when speaking about the covering, says, tell the men, Muslim men, the believing men, that they should lower their gaze and guard their private parts. They're told. As women are told, they're also told. Question 2, is this conforming by other countries, the banning of the hijab for Muslims, a sign that non-Muslims are fearful of Islam? Yes, it does represent something of a fear. They see in Islam this wearing of the hijab, a fundamentalist upsurge, and they link it to terrorism, which of course is a false link, because fundamentalism, going back to the fundamentals of Islam, is something required of all Muslims. And this has no link with terrorism. Terrorism is something else. A person may be an atheist and a terrorist. He could be, a Muslim who is not practicing Islam and he's a terrorist. It doesn't necessarily link with practicing Islam. So it's a misunderstanding on the part of many people in the West, unfortunately promoted by the media, that fundamentalism means terrorism. If women wear complete hijab, covering the face, then identification will be difficult, as for the Prophet saying that they should be identified when she goes with a man. Well, I don't know about that saying. In fact, the idea is that she is not identifiable, easily identifiable. It is sufficient that she knows who her husband is and where they have to meet. It is not necessary that the husband be able to identify his wife, when she is amongst other women in a similar dress. This is not a necessity. Some parents say, I will leave it up to my daughter to decide. What do you have to say to them? Well, this is a mistake. This is a mistake. It is something which Allah has already decided. So to say, I will leave it up to my daughter to decide, is to go against the commandment of Allah, is to give the right of decision which belongs to Allah to your daughter. This is a big mistake. Of course, many Muslims who are not applying Islam properly find themselves in a difficult situation when they recognize culturally that a girl has now become a young woman and she needs to be covered, and they ask her to cover and she doesn't want to. They have to struggle with this. Then they say, okay, I'll leave it up to you. But the reality is that the Prophet ﷺ said, teach your children prayer by the time they're 7. علموا أولادكم الصلاة بسبع. Teach them prayer by the time they're 7. Teaching them prayer involves teaching them hijab. Because to teach a young girl how to pray, it doesn't mean the physical actions alone. It means the dress that accompanies it, that she must cover herself accordingly what is acceptable for prayer. And she learns that dress from the time she's 7. By the time she reaches puberty, you'll not have any problems encouraging her to wear the hijab, because she'll already be doing it. Maybe not as complete, maybe at that time she wears it in the most complete sense. So that only becomes a problem for those people who are not following the prophetic instructions. How long would it take for Arab women to take off the hijab, going at the present trends? Well, I'm not a fortune teller, so I really can't give you an answer to that one. And in any case, these trends are cyclic. If we were to go to Egypt, for example, 60 years ago, you would hardly find any woman wearing a scarf. Hardly find it. Today, you can't go anywhere without finding women wearing scarves. When I was in Malaysia in the 60s, I lived in East Malaysia, which is a Muslim country, I never saw a single woman in hijab. Not a single woman. Not one. Even, I found myself when I went to Medina to study, during Hajj, and I saw these women that looked like the women of Malaysia, all covered up, except for their face and hands. I asked some friends of mine, where are these people from? Because they look like Malaysia. They said, Malaysia. I said, what? I never saw anybody dressed like that in Malaysia. Because what they would do, they knew that when you pray, you had to cover yourself. They would carry these garments in bags when they go to the mosque, and then when they get inside, they'd put it on, and they'd pray in it and put it back in the bag and leave. So I never saw it the whole time I was there in Malaysia. Now, when I went back in the 90s, it was everywhere. The schools, the public places, everywhere. So even if you may find a society leans at one point towards a relaxing, the overall trend of Islamic awakening will help it come back in line. So I don't fear for the future in that regard. Question: you speak of extremes in the West, topless, miniskirt, etc. But are gloves, niqabs, to the point where women cannot see, etc., not extreme as well? Why can there not be a respectful middle ground of conservative, modest dress? Thank you. Well, the degree to which a woman covers herself, if she chooses to cover herself to the point, as you said, where she can't see well, of course, that may be a bit of an extreme, where it's going to hinder your walking, you're bumping into poles and falling and tripping and things like this. So we say this is an extreme. You should at least have a minimum of being able to maneuver in society, right? So, but still, even with the niqab and the glove, we can't say niqab and the glove is extreme. If it is sanctioned by the religion and a woman chooses to do so, then that is her option. There is no harm coming from it to the society or to herself. There's no harm coming from it to the society and to herself. In fact, one recent study, a doctor I was reading talking about societies where women wear the face veil have fewer incidences of nose and throat infections because it acts as a screening out. So there's benefits, in fact. Now, if we go to the other extreme, where people, the topless and the miniskirt, we say there's harm, there's obvious harm there, So where are we going to find the modest means? Okay, what do you consider modest? What you consider modest, another person may not consider modest. So we have difficulties. If it's left to the individual to decide, then we have problems. This is why, as Muslims, we say, leave it to God. Let God decide. Because we really don't know what's best for us. So this is the Islamic approach to it. As I said, abuse of women, harassment of women in general, sexual harassment of women, which sometimes may reach the point of rape, and many other times it's not to that point. We do, common sense does tell us that this is going to be related to clothing. This is just basic. For a person to say, no, it has nothing to do with clothing. If I wear a bikini, it's not going to excite men. And in fact, if I wear a complete covering, you can't see anything of me, that might even excite them. Yes, there may be a man excited by that. But all men are excited by the bikini. That's reality. Let us not fool ourselves. Okay, our time's running out. We have hit the hour of 10 o'clock. And though we have a number of questions remaining, what I can do is maybe I'll save them for the center. We can answer them at the Qatar Guest Center, where we have regular classes in the evening. I have regular Friday classes there. I can answer some of them in my question and answer period, because time will not permit going through all of them. And if you didn't receive a brochure before leaving, please collect one, which informs you about the Qatar Guest Center, which is the main body involved with setting up this program. And inshallah, we'll be having other public programs. We hope that you will continue to take part. Okay, just running through a few of these other questions. Is it permissible for children of the age 13 and 14 to wear hijab, that is the head cover, only at school, where the girls and the boys are separate? The hijab doesn't cover the chest. Well, 13, 14 is the age of puberty, so a proper hijab should be worn by a girl of that age. The point at which it becomes a requirement, an obligation, religious obligation, is the age of puberty. In your speech, you mentioned that in the U.S. there's around 400 people converting to Islam daily in the U.S. Is there proof for this comment? Yes, it is.